All right, it is Thursday, April 22nd, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to break down Triller. Obviously, they had a huge event this past Saturday with Jake Paul versus Ben Askren. Lots of crazy things that happened with that. You had all those musical performances, you had the slap fight, you had Ric Flair, you had everything under the sun. We're going to break down that event and also talk about the pay-per-view buys that are out there, because there's a lot of different numbers that are floating out in the social media space about what that event did. I'm going to break down which I think are the most accurate and what it means from the business, as well as just looking at what did they do right with this event, what did they do wrong, where can they, gain more of a competitive advantage, what are their weaknesses. I'll break down everything Triller on this week's episode. Then we're going to talk about Endeavor. So been a couple of updates on the Endeavor front. They've got their roadshow out there now, so you can check out that roadshow and see what they're pitching to investors in a digital format. Also, a important article in the New Yorker talking about Emanuel and his rise as Endeavor CEO, with some nuggets of information about how the UFC was able to function during the pandemic. And it might actually get you wondering as to, what really went down with Fight Island, because there's some good information in there about that. Then we're going to talk Invicta. They obviously have a new deal with AXS TV. It's an interesting deal for a couple of reasons, specifically because AXS TV let go of LFA fighting. So I'm going to break down that piece, as well as what it means for Invicta moving forward, and, what the benefits and costs are from a business standpoint. And lastly, I do want to touch on Rich Chou stepping down from Bellator as the longtime matchmaker. He's going to go over to Wimp to Warrior. I'm going to break that down a little bit because it's going to have some ramifications for Bellator moving forward. So as always, the timestamps are at the bottom, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so let's talk about Triller. So this past weekend, when you had Jake Paul versus Ben Askren, that was the main event, but you had a slap fight that Ric Flair oversaw. You had musical performances by Ice Cube, Snoop Dogg, the new group, Mount Westmore, I believe, which had Too Short and one other, E40, of course, E40, along with Ice Cube and Snoop Dogg. You had performances with Justin Bieber. It was a concert / just celebrity gala / boxing match as the main event. That's really what it was. It was a spectacle to behold. But in terms of just Jake Paul versus Ben Askren, this had more social media interest and more YouTube interest than I think any other event outside maybe Dustin versus Conor 2 the entire year, or maybe even the past year. Definitely the past year. I mean, this was massive. Every site that was a big name in the MMA media space was covering this, was, just throwing content out there, especially on YouTube, right? Where Jake Paul, got his fame from, his appearances, as well as Logan Paul, all that stuff. I mean, it was something else to see some of these numbers. You had channels that normally get a couple hundred views or a couple thousand end up getting hundreds of thousands of views covering this. We only did one video on it here, talking about after the event, whether the fight was fixed or not, because a lot of people were going to social media saying it was a fixed fight. Check out that video on our channel if you want a further breakdown of that. But it was a massive event. And that's semi an indictment on, the media space right now, because it's all about clicks and it's all about, click-throughs, all that type of stuff. Because you had tons of MMA outlets covering this hardcore, just throwing stuff at this. Places that would never really touch boxing, or maybe do like a one-off boxing piece, were just bombarding things within, probably using the justification like, well, Ben Askren is there. Well, yeah, okay, that's sure. But, again, it is what it is. Point being, this was a massive event in terms of interest. But as we know, social media metrics and YouTube metrics are not always equated over into pay-per-view buys. And I will get back to the pay-per-view buys in a minute, but just breaking down the event itself, let's talk about the good. Good was it was highly entertaining. It was unique beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Even if you weren't a boxing person, let's say I'm part of a couple, which I am. I do have a girlfriend. And I want to see Jake Paul versus Ben Askren, and I don't really care about the musical acts. Well, my girlfriend might be all about Justin Bieber or Snoop Dogg or any of the many performers they had. I think Doja Cat was another one. That would entice them to watch, right? You had the slap fight with Ric Flair. So if you had a wrestling personality in the room, they might say, oh, I want to check that out. Yeah, sure. Why not? This is a huge event and Ric Flair's going to be overseeing a whole thing. Wow. Yeah, sure. It was a calculated move to bring in not only boxing fans or, Jake Paul fans or freak show circus fight fans, but also grab some other people that might not care at all about the boxing matches. Right? That was a big part of it as well. It's something they did in their inaugural event when they had Mike Tyson there. They had these concerts in between, essentially, like 3 or 4 tracks in between. They'd have a performer do. They upped that to a whole new level this time around. They, had a stage. They had full performances. It was the type of stuff you would see at, the Emmys or the Grammys or something where it's like, hey, and now in between giving out, this particular Grammy, here's so-and-so, and they do a live concert. That's really the style it was. Only instead of giving out Grammys, it was fights. It was boxing. So, or slap fight, right? Which was in itself its own crazy thing. It's an interesting and smart play, and no one else is really doing it. And that differentiation is a big plus on Triller's end. We've seen circus fights before, right? Or celebrity boxing, which was a big hit when it was on. It still had, the last celebrity boxing bout they had still garnered pretty good ratings on Fox, I believe. I forget the exact number, but it was better than the UFC on Fox did. It was a big deal. So they essentially took that type of model and realized, well, the problem is it's still boxing. So if I don't care about boxing, even if it is Jake Paul versus somebody or whoever, it could be anybody. If it's boxing and I don't like boxing, I just don't like to watch fighting, I'm not going to be interested. But by adding in these elaborate musical performances and gimmick fights and celebrities and personalities, they rope in people that might not really care for boxing, but may want to, have somebody, they may have somebody they know who's going to watch it or wants to watch it. And then they say, well, I don't really care about the boxing, but I do like this musical lineup. And I am curious to see this slap fight. And, Snoop Dogg's going to be commentating. And, Mario Lopez is there. Well, okay. You know what? Screw it. I'll throw in I'll go in with you to buy this. Right? I think that was the idea behind it. And I think they executed it very well. Because it was much more of a concert than it was a boxing card, if we're being honest. Right? I remember, I remember a couple of the undercards, not many. I obviously remember Frank Mir and I remember the main event. But beyond that, and the slap fight, I do remember the slap fight just because of the commentary, but it was mostly performances. I remember a lot more of the elaborate performances and songs and all that stuff. All uncensored songs, mind you, which is in itself its own type of thing. You don't see that often, especially not on the Emmys or Grammys or what have you. So it was interesting. It was a unique idea. And then you had the debut of that, new rap group with E40, Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, and Too Short. It's an interesting idea, and I think they pulled it off well. I think they had enough going on with, stage gimmicks. It felt kind of like a televised concert, which were popular and started kind of take off towards the middle/end of the pandemic before we had vaccines, right? Is you had a lot of artists putting on virtual concerts. It was essentially what this was. It was not just one artist, it was so many. It's, again, a combo I would not have thought of off the top of my head, but it works very, very well. And it gets more eyes and crossover from both the YouTube and fight community as well as the fans of those musical artists. So well done to Triller there. In terms of some issues they had, I think their biggest flaw, before I go into that, so they did that well. I think they did a good job breaking things up with Pete Davidson in the back doing just goofy stuff. And they kind of, the way that they transitioned between events, or between sets rather, whatever you want to call it, was done in a kind of aloof way where they acknowledged it, right? Like Pete Davidson was like, man, this tells you how serious this event is, based on the fact I'm doing backstage reporting, and here comes this guy. And it kind of just openly poked fun at itself at times. And I think that worked really well. I think it kept a viewer thoroughly entertained. I know I was very entertained because you never knew what was going to happen next. Had a lot of people that swore off the event. They were like, man, I don't even want to watch it, but I'm going to because I have to for a various site or what have you, who ended up changing their tune. I think I was one of them. I was not super excited about the match initially, to be honest. But their production was very, very good. So I think that all was phenomenal. Things they need to improve. Their commentary was a little, fun, but it kind of got out of control, especially when you had Oscar De La Hoya during the Frank Mir fight. That's probably the best example. You had it got to the point where the commentary really distracted from the fight. And that's never a good thing. With that type of commentary and that type of production, that is going to be much, much harder to get a diehard fan base that keeps coming back, right? A customer is going to love that once, maybe twice, 3 times, but that's going to get old real fast. And so they've got to kind of rein it in and set up more of a structure of, hey, this is exactly how it's going to be every single time, because that's really what viewers want and customers want in anything. It's hard and kind of weird to think about, but generally a lifelong customer of whether it's a service, a product, what have you, becomes a lifelong customer because they enjoy the product or service and they know and expect it to work the way that it actually does. Right? If you love a particular restaurant and you love their, let's say, pizza, right? Let's say it's an Italian restaurant. You just absolutely love this restaurant. You love their margarita pizza. It's just the best thing in the world for you. It's just chef's kiss. If I go in there and I order that pizza, I expect it to taste phenomenal every single time. Taste bad once? Oh man, well that sucks. That's kind of a disappointment. Taste bad 2 or 3 times? Well, okay. Like, man, I guess their pizza kind of went out the window. Screw it. And you might not come back anymore. You're probably not going to be as adamant about going there as you once were, that's for sure. But that can apply to any product or service. With what Triller has done, it's this kind of chaos and, you've got to fight and all this stuff, but a customer and a viewer can't really know what to expect next time, right? Show 1 and show 2 were wildly different from production to commentary to musical acts to everything. I mean, it was like a brand new product, and they're early and new. And so that's kind of to be expected, but they're going to have to refine that into something they can do over and over, something that's repeatable, and a type of show that's repeatable that then gains customers and fans that want to keep coming back. And right now, what they did last weekend was awesome and huge, but it's not going to be the repeatable style. You literally can't repeat what they did last week, especially because they didn't have that structure. So that's kind of a weakness they need to address. Let's circle back around to the pay-per-view buys then, right? So we've gone over some strengths, some weaknesses in terms of how the event actually did. There's a lot of numbers out there. Jake Paul himself put on Instagram that it was 1.3 million. Then he said it was 1.5 million buys. You had a Bad Left Hook listed as 1.45 million to 2 million. You had Damon Martin from MMA Fighting, I think listed at 1.2 to 1.6. You had Kevin Iole in that similar range. It sounded like initially it was at least 1.2 to 2 million. And because of the way they were counting buys, who knows how it's going to go. But John Nash tweeted out that according to his sources, they were looking at close to anywhere from 300K to 500K buys. Now, why would Nash's sources be so different than almost everyone else's? Well, here's the thing. If you go back and look at some, search Triller and search pay-per-view buys, and you do a little bit of digging, you'll find an article that talks about how former employees say that Triller inflates their numbers big time. The version I read was on The Verge, but I know the original article comes from another place. But if you go to The Verge, you can find it there. But it talks about, how several, I think it was 6 employees that used to work at Triller come out and say, well, I mean, the numbers they're touting are just false. They're just crazy inflated. There's no way that's accurate. Whatever. Triller responded saying that these were disgruntled employees, that their numbers were correct, et cetera, of course. How do we reconcile this? Right? In this day and age, if your numbers aren't the best, it does not hurt to let reports of inflated numbers get out into the public. Right? This wasn't Triller coming out and saying, hey, man, this is the exact amount of pay-per-views we sold. No, they're not going to do that. At least not yet. They're talking about going public. If they go public, then that information will be made public to everyone, but that's not what they're doing right now. So they're not going to, come out and say, hey, we sold this many pay-per-views. Similar to how the UFC doesn't come out and say, yep, we sold this exact number of pay-per-views. Because that can put them in some, precarious positions if they do that and the numbers aren't completely accurate. So they're never going to do that. But a report on, oh, hey, here's your numbers, or someone leaking the number to a reporter who then says, oh, here's your numbers, similar to what happens with UFC pay-per-view buys, as I'm sure you know, as if you watch this show. If you are new to the show, you can go back and search any one of the pay-per-view buy episodes and I break it all down. But the big thing here is, in this day and age where you can't easily verify pay-per-view numbers like you used to be able to, a la Dave Meltzer from, Wrestling Observer, because you had so many sources of the pay-per-views, so you could get enough and kind of, get at least a rough estimate, have it be pretty accurate. Nowadays, if I only sold 500,000 pay-per-view buys, and then some report goes out there and somebody leaks, 1.5 million, and then a bunch of places run with it, that only helps me. That only makes me look better than I actually am, which only helps me as I'm looking to get investors as I'm thinking about going public, right? And I never came out and said, oh, no, it's 1.5. Yeah, that's right. No, not at all. So, it's interesting. It's very, very interesting because I, for one, would trust Nash's numbers more than pretty much. I mean, I don't know bad left hook enough, so I don't want to, disparage them. And I'm not disparaging anyone that has, set out numbers that are 1.2 or whatever. But I would trust Nash's numbers more because my guess is the other people that are reporting on this, their sources may be all the same. And I don't know that for sure. I am just speculating here. But the reason I trust Nash's numbers above everyone else is because he has consistently, to, his own detriment in many times, many times, he has consistently put out good information regarding financials of promotions. And I would trust his sources as well because he is not afraid to publish things that may cause a backlash from a particular promotion. I think that is something that is very, very important. So, again, not hating on the other guys because I truthfully don't know whose numbers are accurate, whether it's theirs, whether it's Nash's, and even out of the other, right? Everybody's got kind of a different variance. I don't know nobody but Triller really knows. But I trust Nash more, and I think that's probably more of the accurate number because of, again, his track record and his ability to not care if a promotion blacklists him or gives him, trash or anything like that for releasing information that may not put them in a good light. So I'm going to say that it's probably 300 to 500K, at least right now. I'm going to trust that number more than the others. And again, in the scenarios that I outlined in terms of getting people involved, you think probably a lot of people ended up splitting this, right? So I wouldn't be surprised by that. That doesn't necessarily reflect the full amount of viewership, which again goes back to the beginning of this, where we've seen previous UFC fights or UFC pay-per-views where the embeddeds or, the countdowns or what have you kill it on YouTube. And yet the pay-per-view buy numbers are not stellar. They're not bad, but they're not, out of the park. They don't correlate 1-to-1, so to speak. Especially when you're looking at Jake Paul, a lot of his fan base is younger. They probably don't have a ton of disposable income, right? Some of them are still, kids. And so I would not be shocked if, again, those numbers on YouTube and on social media are extremely high, but then the actual pay-per-view numbers are 300 to 500K. I'm going to trust Nash on this. Could be wrong. Could easily be wrong. But I'm going to trust his sources. And I'm going to assume that's around what it did. Because if it really did 1.2 to 1.6, and I did have friends that never watch fighting, hit me up and say, hey, what's going on with this? So it definitely did well, I think. Even 300 to 500K buys is still well, by the way. But I don't know. It's hard for me to believe it did in the same range as Dustin versus Connor, right? I don't think Jake Paul is that much of a draw. And I don't think you had enough of extra entertainment there to really elevate at the next level. So I'm going to go 300, 500K buys, broken down the strengths and weaknesses. We'll see what Triller does next. I am excited to see what they do next. They have a lot of momentum. If they ride this momentum and use it correctly, they could turn this into a big thing. So whether or not they did 1 point whatever million or 500K buys, given how new they are still in a very good spot. And they still, I'm sure, made a profit on this event. That's the other thing. A lot of people overestimate how much some of these performances cost. It does not cost $2 million to get Justin Bieber to have a performance on Triller, right? I mean, you can look up in a lot of cases. You can look up what it costs for somebody to come and do a mini performance. You can contact an agent, or there are things out there that says like, yep, this is the cost for a concert or for so many songs or what have you. And it's a lot, but it's not millions upon millions for every performer. So that's another important thing. They didn't break the bank getting all those musical acts and celebrities and what have you. That didn't happen. That's important as well. They made a profit. That much I am pretty positive of, especially then you got Ben Askren not asking for a percentage. I'll break that down another day, but yeah, they made a profit. Good for them. I'm excited to see what they do next. And they've got a lot of momentum. And if they keep riding it, who knows where Triller could go. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is Endeavor. So a couple of updates there that we should go through, especially given some new information that's come out from an article in the New Yorker that follows Ari Emanuel specifically. So first off, Endeavor now has their roadshow that's available for anyone to watch. So you can go to Retail Roadshow on Twitter. If you just search Retail Roadshow Endeavor, that should pop up a link to a Twitter account. Even if you do it through Google, it should still get you to the same place. And you'll click on that, and then that will basically give you this, presentation that Endeavor is giving to investors as they travel and as they talk to prospective investors about why you should buy shares of their stock when their IPO happens. It focuses heavily on the UFC. It almost right off the bat, it talks about platform, network effects, things you would find in a typical roadshow. But the first thing they cover is their, sports-owned properties, which is really focused on the UFC. And they say that, in the presentation. They say it's a crucial part of their business at this point. And when you take into account that they're also looking to buy out the rest of the UFC and raise some private funding to do that, it makes all the sense in the world that they're going to lead with that first. The other interesting part, before we get into the Ari Emanuel piece, is Endeavor's valuation has gone up to $10 billion, or at least that's what they're looking for. And I believe the share price would be around $23, $24 target at IPO. In 2019, their valuation was pegged around $6.5 billion. That means that $3.5 billion has been added in the span of about 2 years. And as John Nash puts, they haven't really added anything else to their portfolio, right? It's been pretty much just the UFC and looking to buy out the rest of the UFC. So they are saying that they are not doubling, but, adding quite a bit to their valuation just by owning the remainder, the 49% they don't own of the UFC. That tells you, again, as I've said multiple times on this show, the UFC is their crown jewel. It is the centerpiece, the cornerstone of the rest of their operations. They could not build out the empire they're really looking to have without the UFC at its center. And that's why they're making that move to buy out the other 49%. I mean, look, if you're adding, roughly 35%. No, actually it is 35%. 35% to your valuation based on owning 49% of a property you already are the majority owner of. It is basically your business. That means that is your core business and you have side businesses. And mind you, Endeavor is originally a talent agency, right? They were not involved in any of this stuff. They were all about representing big names in NFL, MLB, sports, everything. They have now turned into the owners of the UFC. They still have their talent agency as they go through in the roadshow. They still have other live event experiences. That's a big thing. They have Endeavor Streaming, which is their platform that hosts UFC Fight Pass, as well as a couple of other things they've got in the works. They break it all down. That's great. But without the UFC, they are really, really a much smaller conglomerate. They lose so much of their value. Say at least 70%. I'd wager to say probably closer to 80%. If the UFC was not part of the portfolio, I'd say they'd probably be worth around $2 to $3 billion. Right? That's the UFC is now Endeavor's core product. And the importance of this too is that when you look at that valuation increase, when Endeavor does go public, they do have to file public financial reports. It's not going to be a breakdown of, here's what happened in the UFC specifically, right? And we lost out on the UFC IPO, which sucks and is infuriating. But because the UFC is so much of their business, we're still going to be able to extrapolate a lot of good information and insight into UFC financials and operations, right? This isn't Viacom, who owns Bellator, but then also owns Showtime and all these other things, where they have a much more diverse, portfolio that it's hard to pinpoint. Well, here's exactly what Bellator did in terms of revenue and cost and all. It's harder to get that information and to get a kind of solid grasp on that. You still can, but it takes a lot more work. With Endeavor, at least right now, when they go public, when you're looking at a lot of the revenue, when you're looking at a lot of the costs, all these other things, again, it's not an exact science. You're not going to be able to say, oh, this is, UFC, this is the live event section, here's the agencies. No, but there will be categories you'll be able to break down where it will say a certain name of a category, and really that's just going to mean the UFC. Or it's going to mean the UFC and like one other thing, and it's going to be, you can probably figure out a ballpark of what that other, thing is, so that you end up knowing some UFC financials. That's important. That's very important moving forward. So there's more information in the roadshow. Highly recommend you check it out and see for yourself, because I'm not going over all of it here. But that gives you an idea of some updates on Endeavor that are pretty crucial. Some other things we learned in this New Yorker article about Ari Emanuel. Talks about, his rise as a talent agent and then wanting to be this mogul and all this other stuff. A good, piece on him, I think, that highlights a couple of critical things. But one thing that really stood out was a particular name. I'm going to butcher it, as I always do, and that's Khaldoun Al-Mubarak, who is a friend of Ari Emanuel's. And the reason that that's important is because, and that name is important, is this is a friend of Ari Emanuel who really helped him get Fight Island going. So apparently when the pandemic hit and they were trying to figure out what they were going to do, UFC, that is, an Endeavor, in terms of hosting events and, as they're bleeding money, as all of their live events shut down, that as I've gone over multiple times here, that crippled Endeavor severely. He had cuts. You had, debt rising, being downgraded by Moody's. It was a nightmare for them. But UFC holding events and doing Fight Island in particular was a massive boon that really helped them stay afloat. And basically, this guy, this Khaldoun Al-Mubarak, knew Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates and is also a big fan of Habib, and was able to, pull some strings. It's not about what you know, it's who you know type deal here, and get Fight Island set up for the UFC. And what that did was really allowed the UFC to continue, especially because the United Arab Emirates paid for pretty much everything. So, according to the article, Abu Dhabi not only built the arena and provided private planes, food, housing, testing facilities, and medical staff, it also paid the UFC for each fight at rates that compensated for the absence of ticket sales. That's huge. So we knew that the UFC going over there probably had something to do with their deal with the United Arab Emirates government with tourism. But now we know that really it's due to Ari and his friendship with this guy, Mubarak, who then knows MBZ, the ruler, or de facto ruler rather, who then essentially just payrolls the entire UFC Fight Island, Yaz Island bubble, right? Pays for everything, pays for planes, lodging, pays for each fight, and compensates for the absence of ticket sales. That's huge. Huge. You got to wonder what numbers they probably gave to the government to say, like, hey, here's where a typical event headlined by these guys would probably rank. You got to probably figure that's why they did Conor versus Dustin in Abu Dhabi at Fight Island, right? Because if they were able to go and say, well, this one, a Conor fight typically gives us this ticket sales and get a bump there, I mean, it's crazy, but it's also, again, shows the power of connections, and it shows kind of what really went down. I mean, if MBZ had not been a fan of Habib, had not really cared for MMA, would Fight Island even have happened? Hard to say. Probably not. It's what I'm going to lean towards. So really, it was Ari Emanuel's connection, who then had the connection to MBZ that allowed all of this to happen. I mean, that's big. And it really highlights again how much the UFC is the centerpiece to Endeavor's hopes and their dreams as a giant powerhouse of not just, providing the best live experiences and having the best agents, but also owning sports. Like it's the UFC. It always comes back to the UFC. Notice they didn't look at getting PBR somewhere or, professional bull riding or a different type of thing going. It was all about how do we get the UFC to continue their events. And it was all due to Ari Emanuel's connections. It's crazy, but it's also a common thing in business. This is another very valid point about the old adage, it's not what you know, it's who you know. It's very true. Still to this day, this is a prime example of it. I've seen it in multiple consulting engagements across many different industries. This is a fantastic example of how one simple connection, just one friendship, can yield a life-saving, life-saving event series for Endeavor. Because without that, you really wonder where Endeavor would be. They might very well be bankrupt or needing to spin things off, do a UFC IPO, and do a whole bunch of other things just to stay afloat. This came down to one friendship holding the entire Endeavor IPO together. That's really what it came down to. So important updates there. Very crazy. Again, as we move forward, as Endeavor does end up going public, ends up doing all that stuff, keep an eye on their involvement in the UFC. Because I would imagine, especially if they do raise the funds they need to buy out the remaining 49%, which I expect them to do, and then they have 100% control, there will be changes. What those changes will be, it's hard to say. I would imagine Dana White is still going to be running things, as I mentioned on the other episode, where I covered Endeavor buying out the UFC, where Dana's going to have a lot more, I would say, leeway to do what he pleases in a lot of cases, but there will still be changes. And I think this really highlights that. Again, important updates there about Endeavor, giving some backstory. Again, if you want more backstory on Ari Emanuel, definitely read that entire New Yorker piece. Just search Ari Emanuel New Yorker, you'll find it, no problem. It is titled Ari Emanuel Takes on the World. So again, gives you an idea into where Endeavor is at right now, how they managed the pandemic, and who knows what we'll see from them in the future. But keep an eye out, because changes are coming. I don't know what exactly. I think, again, Dana White's going to have a lot of leeway once Endeavor is able to buy out the remaining 49% of the UFC, which I fully expect to happen. But I would imagine more changes are coming regardless. So next thing I want to tackle is Invicta. Right? Invicta now has signed a deal with AXS TV. They're coming back May 21st. And they've left UFC Fight Pass, and a lot of people wondered where Invicta was going to go. You knew they were going to stick around. I mean, they're too important and too much of a staple of the regional scene to not be around, right? Without Invicta, women's MMA would definitely be lacking in some of the other regional promotions. Some have good rosters, and I won't go through and name which ones have good or bad. You can evaluate for yourself. But others are severely lacking on the WMMA front. So Invicta has always been a great breeding ground for, UFC, Bellator, PFL, main elite level competition. And if they had gone away completely, that would have been a tragedy. So I am ecstatic that they have inked this new deal with AXS TV. It is interesting, though, because if you remember, LFA had a deal with AXS TV, and then when Anthem bought them out, which technically Anthem bought Invicta, right? It's not just, Invicta and AXS came to a deal. That's important. Anthem did buy out Invicta. Important. And when Anthem bought out AXS TV, it was one of those things where LFA just got left holding the bag. I interviewed Ed Soares right after it happened. And, he did not mince his words. It was not kind. It was kind of like, yeah, they just, kind of dropped us and left us to fend for ourselves, and we had to scramble. And so it's strange, because the reasoning at the time had been, hey, we're going to go ahead and cut MMA. At least the perceived reasoning was, we're going to cut MMA and instead focus more on pro wrestling. Because Impact, which, TNA, I don't know if TNA, I don't believe TNA is associated with the title anymore. But at one point, Impact had been kind of the competitor to WWE. It was never as successful as WWE. Not even, you're not even seeing the same level of success that AEW now, right? It is much more of a competitor for WWE. We won't get into all that. But Impact was brought on to AXS TV as LFA was cut. And all the reports and all the perceived reasoning was like, we don't want MMA, we want pro wrestling, we want some other things. Like, okay. So now for them to bring Invicta in tells me a couple things. One, they do not like the numbers for Impact, which I forget what the ratings are for Impact, but they're pretty abysmal. I want to say they're under 100,000 or around 100,000. They just switch nights too. And I don't watch Impact or pro wrestling much, but I do keep up with the ratings and things like that because of some similarities they have with MMA and just the business side of it. And their ratings have not been good. Their ratings have been pretty terrible, pretty awful. So I'm guessing that Impact will probably still stay around. I don't know how long their deal is with AXS TV, but I'm sure they will run out the remainder of their deal. I don't think there's anything worth, AXS TV breaking that contract, whatever it is. But they're probably not going to get renewed, or if they do get renewed, it will be cut because it's not panning out the way that AXS TV hoped. So now they've kind of reevaluated and said, well, pro wrestling didn't really work, but MMA, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. They might be owning up to a mistake. That's the only way, honestly, that I can see why they would now bring in an MMA promotion. Even though Invicta is unique, right? They're all female. They do put on some cool, unique type of things like the Phoenix series, all that. But it's gotta be a just mea culpa on the company's part. And they must have looked at it all and said, well, this didn't pan out how we wanted. Invicta's coming up for a deal, or we can buy Invicta, right? And so I think that just is a huge part of why they're doing this. Because if you look at LFA, right? That's one of the premier feeder leagues to the UFC, Bellator, all of that. Almost every single UFC event, LFA tweets out, good luck, legacy fighting and LFA alum and all RFA alums, and they'll list out a bunch of people. They are elite when it comes to feeder leagues. They are in that elite category of top tier feeder leagues. So it's not like you replaced a kind of unknown or maybe a promotion that doesn't really get a lot of guys that then move on to the UFC and Bellator, PFL, One, all that. You had arguably the biggest feeder league under contract that you let go, and now you're replacing it again with another top elite feeder league, but you're not gaining. It's not like you've replaced it with someone a step up. They are on the same tier. I would put LFA and Invicta in terms of their reputation, just how well their fighters do. I would put them in the same level. I mean, you can't compare them because it's a little bit apples to oranges, in terms of 1-to-1 when you're looking at an all female promotion versus a mixed gender promotion, but you get the idea. They are, it's not that they traded out a loser to get a winner. It was, they had a winner, they let him go, and now they got another winner to replace it. So this has to be management realizing the folly of their ways and looking for an opportunity to correct that mistake. They're never going to say that. They're never going to be like, well, yeah, we, messed up by letting LFA go. I mean, maybe they will like 10 years down the line or something, but they're never going to outright admit that. But that's really what this is. And the fact that they bought Invicta, I think, too, is important in the sense where they're going to have more control over it than LFA and a deal with AXS TV would have had. With a broadcasting deal, you have everything kind of laid out like, hey, this is what's going on. Here's the rights. Here's all this stuff. Here's who does the production of the shows. Here's these agreements, SLAs, all that fun stuff. But it's just kind of a contract. By buying Invicta, you get to experiment and do what you want with it. You get to put your ideas into the promotion. you get to say, you know what, I want to actually have, I like your Phoenix series. Let's kind of switch it up and do this. You get much more control. And I think that's a key difference by Anthem going out and buying Invicta. And I don't know that, Anthem offered something to LFA. It's possible that they made an offer to LFA and LFA rejected it. And then that's when they cut ties, but I doubt it. Because I think I would have heard something along those lines. But with this, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because it allows them to get back in the game and have more control about their product. Which, as Anthem has been going around buying these things, it's clear they want to build a particular brand and a particular image. I think it makes more sense for them to buy Invicta and then tie it into AXS TV the way they want, and then kind of get everything lined up so that they don't have to deal with a vendor or a, outside party and say, okay, this is what we're going for. You need to do this. And then if they have any issues, Invicta could have said, well, no, based on our agreement, I might do this, or, okay, we'll do this, but I'm going to do this my way type of thing. So I get it. I understand why they bought them rather than just signed them to a broadcast deal, but it's essentially Anthem saying we messed up. That's what this signing is, in my opinion. And, congrats to Invicta again. I'm very happy for them. I'm glad they're going to have a broadcast deal that seemingly, is going to be more in their favor than Fight Pass. I know for Fight Pass, you kind of were left to do all of your own production. We're left to kind of, at least based on what LFA had, I'm assuming that's for everything though. It was a lot more upfront work on your end, and then you just kind of got the broadcast money. This would be much more of a synergistic partnership that allows for production and, overhead and administrative decisions all being decided uniformly and through, I'm assuming, one group of executives. So it allows for a much smoother transition, gives you way more help in what you're trying to do. So I'm excited for Invicta. I'm excited to see where they go, especially because they did drop LFA. And remember also Combate, right? That's another MMA promotion they had been working with. So I think it probably comes down to them buying it and, realizing they may have made a mistake going all in on pro wrestling. Last thing I want to touch on real quick here is longtime Bellator executive and matchmaker Rich Chou has stepped away from the promotion. He will remain as an advisor, but he's no longer going to be employed by Bellator in the same way he was. He's going to be doing Wimp to Warrior, which is a program they had over in the EU. I think he's running up the North American operations to expand it, where basically anybody just goes in, does a training camp, gets in shape, and then does an amateur MMA fight is really what they're selling. It's a cool idea. I mean, it's something I thought about doing at one point. I don't know that I would do it now, but it's cool. It's definitely a cool program. I've heard a lot of good things. I know a couple buddies that have actually gone through it over in the UK who loved it. So it's awesome that he's doing that. Full respect to him. What it means for Bellator is, their matchmaker, he's been the matchmaker for 6 years. It's a lot like when Joe Silva left the UFC. You're gonna notice it and not notice it, is basically what it comes down to. You're going to see a pattern, I would imagine, emerge because every matchmaker has, their own particular style on how they want to match certain fighters up, whether it takes rankings into account heavily or whether it takes styles into account or what have you. You get a certain matchmaking pattern and style that emerges. Silva had one. Sean Shelby has one. Whoever replaces, Rich will have one. And I think it's important to note because especially as Bellator comes out with these ranking systems and as they come out with, ranking system rather, and their new brand, where they're not just picking up all of the old veterans from the UFC, like, oh, you used to fight in the UFC, even though you're way past your prime, come on over. They dropped that. They still picked up a couple guys, right? You still have Romero, Anthony Johnson, guys that are still able to fight and compete, but they're not just the retirement league right? That used to be the butt of the joke of Bellator, is the UFC Retirement League. That's not what they are anymore. So with those changes, with the ranking system, with the new Showtime partnership, I would expect you to be looking at Bellator cards from now on and thinking, this doesn't seem like a Bellator card. And what I mean by that is you're going to, again, notice a pattern of whoever takes over as matchmaker. And it will feel like maybe this is because they're on Showtime or maybe not because the rankings are there, but it's really going to come down to the matchmaker because that's the heart and soul of a promotion in a lot of ways. It's brand, it's your marketing, and then it's your matchmaking. If you can have all of the, best marketing in the world and you can have a strong brand, if you have a terrible matchmaker or bad matchmaking, it won't work. It will only take you so far. You need good matchmaking in order to put on and deliver those crazy, exciting fights and those wars that get people interested. To make the Stephan Bonner versus Forrest Griffin type fight. To, naturally, that came about because of The Ultimate Fighter, but you need to replicate, and as a matchmaker, you want to replicate that type of fight every time out, right? You want a card to be full of bangers, to be full of wars, to be just like, man, that was a killer card. You want fans to be saying that every single card. Because if they don't, yeah, you can still get a big name or a big, Conor McGregor or something to lift up the brand. You can limp along, but if it's boring to watch in general for the hardcore fans, it's certainly not going to attract most casual fans, and it's not sustainable. You have to keep the hardcores, even though you ignore them so much of the time when you're just out there trying to attract casuals. You need to keep the hardcore fans' satisfaction level at a certain percentage and at a certain bar. Because if it dips too much, that's when you're in trouble. That's when things start to take a turn. Pro wrestling is the easiest example to compare this to. But, when the hardcore fans turned on WCW, kind of hurt them, right? When they had some of their ridiculous matchmaking styles. Like you watch the rise and fall of WCW, they lost their hardcore fans. They had built up this huge brand. They had all this great matchmaking. And that is different because that's much more of a sports entertainment show. Don't get me wrong. But if you had, let's say, just wrestle fests, nonstop wrestling, day in and day out, right? Just grappler's delight on UFC or Bellator cards and all that. Or you had just blowouts where just 10-second knockouts every time. Yeah, that'd be cool at first, but it would get old. And then how would you build up legitimacy for certain contenders and build up the divisions? It'd be a whole thing. Matchmakers are at the heart of that. It's going to be very interesting to see how Bellator pivots without, Rich Chou there for being in the role he is. He's going to be an advisor. I'm sure he will help out, but eventually he will probably spin off or at least be more hands off. And I'm interested to see the style matchups we see. I would say the UFC, I gotta say, Sean Shelby has done a phenomenal job, in my opinion, with some great stylistic matchups, right? I have noticed that you get a lot of good fights that I'm not sure would have been made in the Silva era. Romanov versus Espino, I think, was a fantastic stylistic matchup. I know they were two up-and-coming contenders, but still, that was a great one. I feel like we've talked more and more the past year or two about good stylistic fights and how it's harder to pick the winner. And if you look at the odds, there's a lot more closer fights. I personally like that. So shout out to Sean Shelby for that. But hopefully Bellator is able to replace somebody like Rich Chou with somebody that can, do a similar job and make Bellator, especially on the prelims, because that's really what's always hurt them, is that usually it's just blowout city. You look at the odds, it's like negative 1,400 across the board. Hopefully they can find a way to make those a little bit more exciting, because I think if they could get more consistent, exciting cards, that would take them a long way with their new partnerships. I think that's one of the biggest things hurting Bellator right now is a lot of people are saying, oh, that Bellator card was kind of or oh, what you'd expect of Bellator. If they can start building some cards out to be a little bit more competitive throughout, have some more exciting fights and matchups, even if they are prelims and even if they do knock out two contenders, kind of knock each other out in terms of, making it into title contention, or one gets a major setback, that type of thing. I think that could be a huge thing there. So it's comes at a kind of shitty time for Bellator, but still, an interesting position they're going to have to fill, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with all of it. All right, well, that's it for today's episode, guys. Appreciate you bearing with me as I'm traveling. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that I am in a hotel room. Still a little sick, so if my voice is hoarse, I apologize for that. I'm hoping to get it resolved. Still working on it, unfortunately. But if you're listening on Podcast Addict, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, anything in terms of a listening platform, thank you so much. I love you guys. I appreciate it. If you're watching, love you guys as well. Please hit that like button, subscribe, bell notification. Always appreciate a view. Leave comments. Again, whether it's on YouTube or you can always add me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. Let me know what you guys think about Triller. Is it sustainable? Do you think that type of business model, is that something that you as a viewer are going to want to tune in every month or so and say, yeah, I definitely want to see what I saw with Jake Paul and Ben Askren again? Let me know about that. Let me know about your thoughts on Endeavor. A lot of moving parts there. Basically, one business relationship got Fight Island going. Let me know your thoughts on that. I mean, it's pretty crazy that information came out, and can only imagine what's going to come out once they actually go through with their IPO. Are you going to buy the stock? Let me know that as well. I've heard a lot of people say yes, heard a lot of people say it's too risky. Let me know your thoughts on that. But any questions, anything you want me to cover, you know where to find me at All Day OJ. And until next time, guys, get money.